Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the 7th chapter of our Painted Stages Fall Apart by Scenes, which is written by Silverheart SP on AO3. It's almost the end. Is there even a light at the end of this tunnel? We can't find out until after the trigger warnings of this emotional rollercoaster of a wump that is this fanfiction. This fanfiction is for general audiences with themes of fluff and angst, near-death experiences, and canon-typical violence. Also, beware of slight manga spoilers. If that isn't your style, then I recommend a real James Bond type, which is written by Hybrid Empress on AO3. It can be found on my channel! Brace yourselves, everybody! Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 7. Red Blood in the Cyan Water. It didn't take Shota long to find someone who could help him. A hero from a small agency whose quirk allowed him to expand and solidify objects. Shota would clear the rubble in the direction Bakugo had come from, and the other hero would stabilize the rubble around where Shota moved it so it stayed upright and formed a tunnel. This way, they would be able to come back up without much trouble as well. Shota knew anyone better at digging than him was already busy with similar tasks, and no victim was higher priority than another, so he would have to do it himself. But he was fast. He and the other hero would be able to go at a respectable pace. The two of them ran back to where they had found Bakugo, Shota barely registering the journey. All that mattered was getting to his student as quickly as possible. He found when he arrived that Uraraka and Jiro had already started on clearing a space for him to begin digging. He breathed a thank you as they jumped back, and he and the other hero hurriedly got to work. The tunnel started out slowly, and as the opening gradually got bigger and started forming into a tunnel, Jiro took initiative and listened to the ground to tell Shota where Midoriya was exactly. Deeper down, at the level where the basement would have once been, there was a very small hole, as Bakugo had put it, where Midoriya apparently was. Jiro said that it felt like the space should have been bigger, but when Bakugo blasted it, it had collapsed inwards and nearly filled up entirely. She wasn't sure why the section Midoriya was in had been protected. After that, they had gotten deep enough that Shota could no longer hold a conversation with them. Shota dug as quickly as he could, hastily removing rocks and obstruction while the other hero worked diligently behind him to form a tunnel. Bakugo, the boy, was incredibly lucky to have explosions powerful enough that they had broken up any major bits of debris near him into smaller bits. Otherwise, Shota wouldn't have been able to get very far at all. In fact, the boy was incredibly lucky to even be alive. He had looked exhausted and terrible. Shota's nerves jolted as he thought about how Bakugo, and apparently also Midoriya, had been trapped deep underground since yesterday. That was nearly 24 hours, in complete darkness, in pain, possibly without air. Shota wondered if the boy had even slept in that time. He was pulled out of his own thoughts when he needed to exert all of his strength to move a particularly large chunk out of the way. Bakugo wasn't important right now. He was safe. He would be looked after and taken care of quickly. Shota could dwell on his own feelings later. Right now, Midoriya was the primary focus. Shota would be lying if he said he wasn't sickeningly worried. It was Bakugo's reaction that had really drilled it in for him. Bakugo never sounded like that. Never. He had sounded scared as he said Midoriya's name, terrified even, as he said there wasn't time. Shota shoved another rock out of the way and continued digging downwards. It was getting darker. He was lucky his goggles also had a night vision function, and he hoped the other hero didn't need much light to work. The small bits of light coming in from the outside helped. It was even getting a bit wider as he glanced back. His students must be trying to make it easier for him to come back up. Shota resolved to thank them later as he charged on, shoving and lifting faster than before. It didn't take much longer for Shota and his partner to reach a layer of rocks that was blocking what seemed to be a wider opening. Shota shoved them aside while the hero behind him solidified them onto the roof. They came to face the very small pocket chamber Bakugo and Jiro had referred to, created by the collapse. Shota thought it must have been larger before Bakugo had opted to blow his way out. Upon a quick glance, the remaining space seemed to be held up by a very large ventilation pipe that had only partially fallen from the explosion. In fact, that was the only thing protecting the rest of the space from getting filled up with debris. Bakugo had been incredibly lucky to have ended up here and not crushed to death. He had been incredibly lucky that Midoriya had been under that ventilation pipe, otherwise the rest of the pocket would have definitely collapsed on top of him with Bakugo's explosions. But Bakugo couldn't have known Midoriya was protected, not in this darkness. Based on the size of the space, the two of them would have begun running out of air by now. Bakugo hadn't been reckless, not as Shota might have first thought. He had done the last thing he could do to try and save Midoriya's life. Get help before they both suffocated, despite the risk to Midoriya's life. If they had waited any longer for help, Shota was sure the tiny space would have run out of air, and they both would have gotten carbon dioxide poisoning. Shota tore his eyes and thoughts away from the structural elements of the small cave, and his ears picked up on a small sound. Ragged and pained breathing. He zeroed in on the far end of the small opening. His night goggles didn't allow him to see perfectly, but he could make it out well enough. It was Midoriya, lying down on his back atop a large pile of torn, open flooring. There was something protruding from his side, straight upwards. His shirt was stained with darkness. His eyes were screwed up in pain, and his breaths were heavy and fast. Shota moved. He made it over to Midoriya in a split second, his heart leaping as he knelt down near the boy to check the injury. He swore. In his peripheral, he knew the other hero had also seen. The hero left quickly back up the tunnel, presumably to go and get paramedics to wait for them outside. He pulled together all his focus and examined the injury. Bakugo had amateurishly tied a torn strip of shirt over the base, but Shota could see more thick, dark red seeping through and dribbling down onto the ground. Every time Midoriya breathed in, his whole torso raised, and he wheezed in what must have been excruciating pain. Shota mechanically raised his hand to Midoriya's throat to check his pulse. It was there, racing and weak, but there. He needed to be fast. Shota quickly glanced down to try and gauge where the thing protruding from Midoriya was coming from. It didn't take him long to realize it was a rebar for part of the internal structure formation of the museum floor, and it must have gotten dislodged in the explosion, and Midoriya had landed on it. Despite this, Shota knew it hadn't broken off from its grid formation with the rest of the rebars. Instead, it had just been bent upwards. It was still part of the floor. That meant he had no choice. He had to pull Midoriya off of it. Shota cringed heavily. Once he did so, he would need to run like he never had before. Once the blockage was cleared, Midoriya would begin bleeding out at a much faster rate. The boy's breath said he was already incredibly close to dying. He didn't have enough time to go and get someone with a quirk who would be able to do it better. "I'm so sorry, problem child," whispered Shota, hating himself for what he was about to do. He quickly moved over so he would be able to pick Midoriya up, bridal style. He hastily leaned over and untied Bakugo's shirt, discarding it among the rocks. He took a deep breath, then positioned one arm under Midoriya's legs and one under his shoulders. Sending another mental apology to his student, Shota lifted Midoriya up. The boy made an awful, wretched, whining sound that flipped Shota's stomach. Despite knowing this was the most logical course of action, he couldn't stem the overwhelming guilt he was feeling at causing his students so much pain. The rebar made a horrible wet noise as Midoriya slid off it. Blood dripped out from the bottom of the wound and splattered onto the floor. Midoriya's breathing hitched. Shota ran. Thank God Almighty for his students. They had dug up enough of the opening to significantly reduce the time it took him to get back up, and he was in the sunlight quicker than if they hadn't been helping. He ran out of the opening. In his peripheral, he could see Uraraka and Jiro startle at his sudden appearance, then simultaneously gasp in horror at the state of Midoriya. Shota caught the eye of a few heroes who were still milling around, now also come to stare at him. "Ambulance! Now!" He barked at them, laying Midoriya out on the cleanest, flattest bit of ground he could find. He didn't care if the other hero had already gone to get them, he couldn't be sure. Thankfully, the heroes in the area were pros for a reason, and two of them obeyed him without a second to waste, disappearing in the directions of the paramedics. Shota turned back to Midoriya. He shook off his capture scarf, quickly bundling it up and pressing it down forcefully on Midoriya's wound. The boy made another awful sound, but Shota grit his teeth and ignored it. Now that they were in the sunlight, Midoriya looked even worse than he had earlier. Nearly his entire shirt was soaked in a horrible red-brown from dried and fresh blood alike. His skin was sickeningly pale, and it glistened with sweat dripping down his forehead and neck. There was grime and dirt covering every inch of him, giving his hair a chalky colour and caking his face. His expression was twisted in pain, even while unconscious, and small whimpers were often heard in between harsh breaths. Shota pressed harder. In his peripheral vision, he saw Uraraka and Jiro approach fearfully. He didn't want them to see this, but he couldn't afford to take his attention off of Midoriya. Suddenly, Midoriya's breathing hitched, then sped up. Shota could feel his heart hammer out of his chest through the capture scarf. His skin was clammy and his whole body was trembling. Then, to Shota's complete horror, he fell silent. Shota quickly placed a hand back on Midoriya's neck. Nothing. The boy was still below him and Shota wanted to vomit. Okay. Field medicine. Now. Shota took his hands off of his capture scarf. He placed both of them on Midoriya's chest, this time not even thinking about how much pain he would be causing the boy. His own heart raced and he began to feel lightheaded. No, pay attention. Shota began chest compressions, pumping down harshly and firmly over Midoriya's ribcage. 30 compressions. Shota took his hands off of Midoriya's chest, pinching his nose with one and tilting his chin up with the other. Behind him somewhere, he heard someone begin to sob in terror, the sound drilling into his soul. Shota breathed twice into Midoriya's airways. He moved his hands back to Midoriya's neck. Blood pounded in his ears. Nothing. Shota took a shuddering, fearful breath and repeated the process. Midoriya would not die. Not on Shota's watch. That was all that was racing through his mind as he kept pounding down. Come on, kid, panted Shota as he finished the next round of compressions. Stay with me, please. He breathed into Midoriya's airways again, trembling. The only noise was that crying in the background, and Shota's own blood rushing through his head. He thought he heard a siren wail in the distance. Shota once again checked Midoriya's pulse. Still nothing. His whole body now shaking, Shota became more haphazard and desperate in his efforts. His compressions were slightly out of sync, but he couldn't make his muscles move to fix them. He was going completely on adrenaline and instinct, and he felt light and dizzy from it. One more time. Shota breathed into Midoriya's airways, full and strong. His heart leapt when, after a second, a gasp came from the body below him. A shaking hand raised to once again check Midoriya's pulse, and fell uselessly away when he felt it there. Shota's heart pounded. He fell back in an intense wave of relief, but knew he couldn't completely relax yet. He returned to pressing down on the wound, checking regularly to make sure Midoriya was still breathing. Uraraka and Jiro shuffled up closer to him. Tears were streaming down Uraraka's face, and Jiro's eyes were wide and fearful.
Is he okay?
Asked Uraraka in a trembling voice, her eyes locked onto Midoriya's prone form. He needs a hospital, now, said Shota firmly. He checked his student's pulse again, still too fast, but there. Uraraka only nodded frantically, her breath hitching, and Jiro remained silent, gaping. The next 30 seconds were spent in tense and panicked silence, Shota pressing hard while periodically checking Midoriya's breathing and pulse. Uraraka had come to crouch on Midoriya's other side, grasping his hand tightly. When the paramedics finally arrived, Shota's arms turned to jelly. He could only watch numbly as Midoriya was loaded onto a stretcher with care and carted off quickly over the pile of obstruction. Midoriya might be breathing again, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. Toshinori had been conversing quietly with an officer when a loaded stretcher was rushed past him. It sped by and Toshinori caught a blur of red and green from the corner of his eye. His mind screeched to a stop. Red and green. His conversation with the officer halted, and he hastily excused himself as he turned to chase after that stretcher. Izuku. It had to be Izuku! The stretcher had come to stop by the back of an ambulance, where paramedics were in the process of transferring the body atop it onto an elevated bed in the vehicle. Toshinori came skidding to a stop, and his heart leapt to his throat when he saw he had been right. His boy was lying still. Through the hovering paramedics he could make out a blood-soaked shirt and the stains of red covering the white fabric of the stretcher. He couldn't tell if Izuku was breathing or not. Toshinori didn't think, he just moved. He avoided the paramedics, ignoring the angered looks they shot him, and stumbled in front of where his boy was lying. Izuku, he choked out. The paramedics removed Izuku's ruined shirt, and there was a disgusting, glinting wound piercing his boy's side. It was still bleeding, red welling up and spilling over every time he breathed. The sounds of his breaths were awful, ragged, harsh and gravelly. He sounded in pain. Toshinori felt like crying. Move, snapped a paramedic. They were getting ready to transfer his boy into the ambulance. Please, begged Toshinori, turning to face him. Isn't one person allowed to ride in the ambulance with him? Direct relations only, said the paramedic without missing a beat. Several paramedics were now surrounding Izuku, and Toshinori felt his heart leap as Izuku became completely obscured from his line of sight. He stretched himself over with his staggering height, fearful of losing sight of his boy. They all worked in sync, smoothly transferring Izuku into the ambulance. He's... stuttered Toshinori, watching with wide eyes as an oxygen mask was lowered onto Izuku's face, and something was inserted into his wrist. A few machines set up in the ambulance blared to life, monitoring his boy's vitals and providing him with some clear liquid from a bag. A staggered beeping had started up, tracking Izuku's heart. He's like a son to me, Toshinori finally settled on, whispering. His eyes pleaded with the stony-faced paramedic. The paramedic's face softened. Fine, he said shortly. Get in now, sit down there, he said, pointing to a small cleared ledge to the right of Izuku. Thank you, Toshinori breathed, already climbing into the ambulance. The paramedic got in after him, and the door slammed shut, leaving Toshinori in the small space with several other paramedics fussing over Izuku. A siren began wailing outside, and the car started moving when the paramedic said something into his radio. Toshinori stared at his boy in the white, artificial light. The background noise around him, the movement and fussing from the paramedics, blurred into nothing in his conscience. All there was Toshinori and Izuku, and the staggered beeping of Izuku's heart. His boy took in a ragged, pained breath. One of his hands dangled off the side of the bed. Toshinori took it gently with both of his own, so gently, and gripped it tightly. Izuku's hand was so small and frail in Toshinori's own massive ones, his skinny wrist disappearing amongst Toshinori's long, bony fingers. Izuku's hand was cold. Toshinori's heart pounded in terror, and he let out a shaky breath. He raised the boy's hand to his heart. "I'm here, my boy," whispered Toshinori. He stayed in that position, frozen in place as the paramedics moved blurrily around him. They were cleaning his wound, wrapping it properly, injecting something into the bag of clear liquid. Toshinori took note of none of this, his eyes fixed on Izuku's still face. The oxygen mask swallowed it whole, making Izuku look small and broken. He turned in to the sound of the beeping coming from one of the machines. It had sped up. It was going fast, too fast. Though his hands had begun shaking as they held Izuku's, Toshinori could feel the boy's pulse pounding in his wrist. It was weak. "Crap, we're losing him!" yelled a voice, and Toshinori's heart skipped a beat. He stopped breathing. "No," he whispered, staring at Izuku. Not Izuku, please, 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 not Izuku." The rapid beeping stuttered for a second, then the beeps turned into the deafening wail of a flat line. Toshinori gripped Izuku's hand so tightly, pressing it against his own heart, which he could feel beating throughout every inch of him. His hands trembled violently. He stared at Izuku, tears filling his eyes. Izuku's chest wasn't moving. No, he whispered again. He felt the world fall out from under him. His boy. He didn't even get to say goodbye. "Please move, sir," Toshinori heard a grim voice saying. Izuku's hand was gently pried from his iron grip and laid back down on the bed. Toshinori didn't move. His hands stayed in their position at his heart. He stared numbly at his boy's still face. It wasn't that long ago when that same face had been grinning brightly at him, his green eyes sparkling in excitement for the museum trip he had ahead of him. Hot tears spilled down Toshinori's cheeks, and he let out a ragged sob. "Clear!" someone yelled, and suddenly Izuku's body gave a violent jerk. Toshinori's eyes slid from his boy's face to his chest, where a paramedic had the paddles of a defibrillator positioned over his heart. There was a beat as the paramedics anxiously all turned to the heart monitor. It remained at a stubborn flatline, and Toshinori let out another sob. "Again!" exclaimed someone. The whine of the defibrillator charging up filled the small room, and the paramedic waited another moment before yelling, "Clear!" and bringing the paddles back down onto Izuku's chest. Toshinori couldn't tear his eyes away. Watching Izuku's form contort again was the most terrifying thing he had ever experienced. His own mentor's face flashed in his mind in that moment. Her last seconds replaying over and over. Her scream of agony. Her bloodied smile. The familiar, wretched helplessness filled him like a poison. Once again he could do nothing but watch numbly as the most precious person in the world was taken from him. Izuku. The whine of the flatline stubbornly refused to change as Izuku jerked back to lay still on the bed. Toshinori let out a pathetic whimper and bowed his head. More tears fell steadily out of his eyes, creating wet spots on his pants. He hitched in another sob, and another, and another. Izuku. Again! Was heard in the distance, over the roaring going through his head. Over the dizziness, the whine of the charging defibrillator and flatline blended into one as Toshinori lifted his head again to look back at his boy's broken form. "Clear!" came another voice. The paddles were lowered a third time, Izuku's body once again jerking upwards. A few seconds passed in stillness, where the whole room held its breath. Toshinori stared at his boy. Then, a break, a beep, then another, cut through the continuous wail of the flatline. Toshinori let out a heavy breath in a sob, his own heart pounding in his chest. He blinked away the tears still in his eyes, his entire body slackening with the incredible wave of relief that came crashing over him. The atmosphere loosened up, the paramedics all letting out relieved noises and beginning to move again. Despite this, tense seriousness still remained, none willing to lose focus for even a second. "ETA to the hospital 2 minutes. Keep him stable until then. He's still critical," a paramedic said to another. Critical. Izuku's life still hung by a thread, and Toshinori could do nothing. Toshinori leaned back over his boy. Izuku's chest was now rising and falling, but he still looked as sickly pale as ever, and every breath looked painful. Toshinori found the hand he had been holding before, resting in solidarity at the boy's side. He took it back in his own, holding on for life, his own life, Izuku's life. He sat like that, Izuku's hand gripped in his own tightly the rest of the way to the hospital. He stared blankly, thoughts barely processing beyond his shock, as the ambulance pulled to a stop and the back door opened. "Get him to Surgery 5, stat!" barked someone. Izuku's hand was once again taken from his own as they wheeled him away. Toshinori's hand felt cold. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. This chapter got me right in the feels. Fuck, I hope that the last chapter brings some comfort to this hurt. I love All Might being a dad to Izuku, but seeing his heart slowly break at the situation is a lot. A little life update. I did the memory walk on Saturday and it was amazing. I raised £130 for Alzheimer's Society, which I can only hope will help kick Alzheimer's ass. All credits goes to the original creator of this fanfiction, Silverheart SP on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah.